So we're up to the Mishnah on the bottom of Daf Tzadi Daled Amud Aleph. Misha holcha ishto lemedina sayam, ubo, bo means shnei edim, v'amrlo mesa ishtecha, and therefore if your wife died, you're allowed to marry her sister. V'nasas achosa, he married her sister, v'achakach bas ishta. His wife returns from Medina Sayam, and Baruch Hashem, she's alive and well, but that's not so good, because he's been married to her sister, which is an Isur Karetz. And the premise is that any children that he might have had from his sister during the life of his wife is a mamzer. Nevertheless, the Mishnah Paskins, Muteres Lachzor, here we turn to today's daf, which is Tzadi Daled Amud Beis, low. And the fact that he married her sister does not generate an Isur vis-a-vis his wife. So he's allowed to go back and resume his marriage with his wife. And the marriage with his wife's sister is not at all valid. And a mutar b'krovo shnia, he's allowed to marry the relatives of the sister that he married. Like, for example, he can marry her daughter. And it's not considered bas ishto because we don't recognize that marriage to the second wife at all. That's chiyuvei kares. Ushnia mutaris b'krovov. And the other one, the one that he married, meaning the second wife, so he was married to Rachel. He thought Rachel died, he married Leah. Then as far as Leah is concerned, mutaris b'krovov. He's allowed to marry, let's say, for example, his son. Even though normally you're not allowed to marry your husband's son, but here in this case, she was not married to her, so to speak, husband. The im mesa rishona mutar b'shnia, and with the death of Rachel, his first wife, he's allowed to marry Leah, his second wife. So there's no isur that results as from the marriage that he had to the second to Leah, not vis-a-vis Rachel. He resumes his marriage with Rachel, not vis-a-vis Leah, in event that Rachel passes away. Amru lo. Now we have another case where one witness came, and he testified Mesa ishto v'nasas achosa. So he married Leah, the sister of his wife Rachel, based on the testimony of one witness. V'achach amru lo. And then they notified him that she, at the moment that you married Leah, Rachel was alive. Mesa, and then subsequently Rachel died. And now we want to know the status of any children he had from the second wife, from Leah. Havlad Rishon, in other words, the Vlad that was born while Rachel was alive, before Rachel's death, is a mamzer, but the Vlad that was born after the death of Rachel is Eino mamzer. He's not a mamzer. Now the Mishnah records the sheet of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi Omer Kol sheposel al yidei acherim posel al yidei atzmo v'chol she'ein posel al yidei acherim eino posel al yidei atzmo. So the word al yidei in modern Hebrew would be bishvil acherim. In other words, he parcels the sister to our husband. And we're going to have a machlokas later on about exactly what this means. We're going to have Rav Ami, who holds that he parcels the achos b'biyaso, shenosel b'yed echad, shemeis b'ayla richon, according to Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. Rabbi Yossi is worried about the fact that maybe we consider that the marriage to Leah was kedasu kedin, and how could she go out without a get? And therefore, once she gets a get, that will parcel her to go back to her husband, because it looks like he's machzer grushaso mishenises. So the kshenis al pi shnei edim shmeis baila ein eseres biyasalach salad baila. But we're talking about a case where there was only one witness, and therefore she's asura lachzol labaylo, according to Rabbi Yossi, and Belideder will see an explanation of Rabbi Yossi Shita on Daf Tzadi Amid Beis. Gemara says that in the Mishnah, he's allowed to go back to his first wife, and that makes sense if the second wife, meaning Leah, was not married, she's a pnuya. The afalga, and even though the sister Leah was married to someone else, now this is much more complicated, because if, let's say, Reuven was married to Rachel, he assumed that Rachel had died. He married Leah, but Leah itself is married to someone else. The Ozel Ishto, the Giso, Limedina Sayam. So what happens is two people in this case went out to Medina Sayam. It was his wife and his brother-in-law, who's married to Leah, his wife's sister. Now, Aiden came, or let's say one aide came, and testified that both of them died, both his wife and his brother-in-law. So he married Leah, who's now an Ashes Ish, not knowing that his brother-in-law is still alive. He married Leah, who's Achos Ishto, not knowing that his wife is still alive. So now his wife and his wife's sister's husband come back alive and well from Medina Sayam, Hani Nisuin, and this Nisuin to Leah is valid, not valid as a Nisuin, but what are the repercussions of that marriage? They come mitzvah, Ashes Giso, Agisa. Leah could no longer resume her marriage with what we'll call him Avram, right, with her husband. Why? Because if you remember, at the beginning of this chapter, we learned that if a married woman relies on the testimony of one single aide and then she gets married to someone else, so that aide testified that her husband was dead. She relied on the testimony of the aide, got married to someone else, and as it turns out, her first husband is alive. Then she can no longer resume her marriage, neither with her first husband nor with her second husband. That's going to apply here in this case, where where Leah relied on the testimony of one aide who testified that her husband Avram is dead. Afilu hachi, Eshes kiso asira, but ishto sharia. Even though there's no heter for Reuven to continue his marriage with Leah, and that's because they relied on one aide and Teitzimizem. But nevertheless, Reuven can resume his marriage with Rachel. The law in Rina, now we're not going to apply the principle of mitoch. What's mitoch? Mitoch Esra, Eshes Giso Agiso, Teoser Ishto Olaf. That since he can no longer marry Leah, and not only that, Avram, the husband of Leah, can no longer remain married to Leah. Therefore, we would think that there should be an Easter likewise, a parallel Easter between Rachel and Reuven. But that's not so. Now, from the din of the Mishnah that in the case of a woman who comes from Medina Sayyam after her husband married her sister, she's allowed to resume her marriage. So that we're referring here to Rachel. So we're going to prove that Leah doesn't need a get. So the Gemara says, Lema masnisin to lo Rabbi Akiva, the Ikar Rabbi Akiva, Leah is going to need a get. Avile achos grushaso, and achos grushaso will require a get. Right? So the discussion here, let's just put things in a little perspective, is whether or not Leah, the sister of Rachel, will require a get from Reuven, the husband of Rachel. And you and I would say, well, why is there any requirement of a get between Reuven and Leah, because that marriage is not valid? I mean, that's achos ishto, that's an isakari, saying kedushin tovsin. So why Bechlal bother with get? But the answer is going to be that it looks like he was married. And people might think that if she goes and gets married to someone else without a get, it's like Eishes Ish Yotzeis below get. The Sanya we learned in the Brisa, Kol Arayu Shabbat Torah ain't Srichos Heimenu get. When a man has a marriage relation with an Erev, for the Torah, the Halacha doesn't recognize the validity of that marriage, and therefore there's no need for a get. Chutz, in the following cases, have exceptions to the rule. Eishes Isha, this is Alpi Bezdin, means she relied on one witness that testified that her husband died, and her husband, as it turns out, was alive. She got married Shalom Kedin, and we have a knas of tzricha get. Need a get from this second husband, even though she's not halachically married to him. And Rabbi Akiva Mosif af eishes ach bachos ish. A man marries the wife of his brother. Okay, now let's assume that he thought that his brother was gone, and he relied on one aid to that effect. And he thought he was doing the greatest mitzvah in the world by marrying his almonas achiv, being the kind of the mitzvah of Yibum. And as it turns out, it's not the mitzvah of Yibum, it's a mitzvah of Pilas Eishes Ish, because his brother is actually alive. So in such a case, why does Rabbi Akiva insist that this woman needs a get from her own brother-in-law? The answer is because there's a chash here that people might think that he was actually married to her, that he was Mekayim the mitzvah of Yibum. He writes here in the note, Shema Yomru Sharishon Girsha V'Nisa L'Sheni Kedin Nimtzei Shesich Yotzes Get. Okay, that's the previous case. That's the previous case. That's the case in the Tanakama of Eishes Ish Shenisis Al Pi Bez. Now we have Rabbi Akiva who has Eishes Ah. And here in this case, admittedly, there's not a chash that the Rishon was Megarish and she married the Sheni, because Grushas Achiv is Asuralo. Just 1 second. If they'll say that the first husband divorced her and she got married to the second, she couldn't get married to the second brother if the first brother gave her a get, because that would be Grushas Achiv. So therefore, the reasoning for Rabbi Akiva that requires a get in this case is unclear. But then he has Achos Isha, right? So they relied on one witness that his wife died. And as it turns out, his wife is Baruch Hashem alive and well. And now, what's the status of Leah? He went ahead and married Leah. So we're going to say that Leah needs a get from Reuven. Why does Leah need a get from Reuven? So I don't see this in the commentary here, but I'm going to assume that the answer is because people might say that his wife Rachel died and he legitimately married Leah. So Leah's going to need a get. Oh, now, since according to Rabbi Akiva, in the case where he married her sister, she needs a get, then the Kevan, the Amar Rabbi Akiva, by a get, the Mela Israel, he can no longer be married to his own wife when it turns out that she's alive. And the reason for that is because it's achos krushasa. Oh, Baruch Hashem, the Gemara says, I didn't have to even work it out. So now we have a problem because the Mishnah seems to be against Rabbi Akiva. The Mishnah allows Reuven to resume his marriage with Rachel when she comes back from Medina, say, I'm alive and well. And Rabbi Akiva would ask her because of the Yisur of Achos Kuchasa. And now the Gemara is going to try to reconcile the Mishnah with Rabbi Akiva. And the Gemara is now going to quote Rav and his interpretation of Rabbi Akiva's position in order to reconcile Rav with our Mishnah. Gemara says, Lav Itmar Allah. Didn't we have a brisa to interpret the statement of Rabbi Akiva? Omar Rav Gidol, Omar Rav Chia Bar Yosef Rav, Hai Eishes Ach, and Rabbi Akiva required a get in the case of Eishes Ach, Hechi Dam. See, once we decide what the case of Eishes Ach is, that's going to have an impact on Achos Isha, which is the case that we're interested in. Kigon, Shekidesh Achiv es Ha'isha, Ochlum Dinas Hayam. And this brother, Shama Shemeis Achiv, he heard that his brother died in Medina Hayam, and he left no children. The Omar Venosas Ishta, he wanted to be Miyabim, his brother's wife, and he did so to speak. Now it turns out that his brother's alive. And he made a big mistake by marrying his brother's wife. And here Rabbi Akiva requires a get. The Amri Inshi, because people might say, Hach kamot no havile b'kiddushin, hai shapir nosiv. That maybe the first brother put a condition into the marriage, and the marriage was never chal because the condition was never fulfilled. And therefore, if we have bittul kiddushin, then she's allowed to marry his brother. And hai shapir nosiv. Once again, people will say that an Eishes Isha is going out without a get. Is therefore hai achos isha nami. Let's apply the same kind of analysis. And we're going to say she doesn't need to get it every single scenario. Hechidami kegon shekidish es isha v'holcha lemedinas hayam. So his wife went out to Medina Sayyam, Shoma, Shemesa, that his wife died, Ahmad v'nosas achosa. Now his wife comes back alive and well from Medina Sayyam, and it turns out he married Achos Isha, and then Kedushin talks about Achos Isha. But Rabbi Akiva required that she have a get, that Leah, before she marries anyone else, needs to get from Ruvain. The same exact logic that we applied to Shesach, we're going to apply now to Achos Isha. And people are going to say that there was a T'nai in the original Kedushin. It means that if the T'nai was Batel, then he was really never ever married to Rachel. And when he married Leah, Shapirnos, if it was a valid marriage. And once again, if Leah doesn't get a get, then people are going to say that she's a Neishas Isha Yotzis below get. Now the Gemara is going to say there's a distinction between the case in Rabbi Akiva and the case in the Mishnah. We can reconcile that Ella Nisuin, when he married Rachel with a Maitha Nisuin, and then Rachel, went to Medina Sayyam, and now he hears that she died. He marries Leah. Mikal and Meimar Tna Havile Benisuin. It's impossible to talk about the possibility of T'nai Benisuin. This is all based on what we call Ein Adam Otze Bilaso Bilas Nus. So when a man marries a woman, not just with Kiddushin as a formal act of kinyan, but he goes through and implements the intimacy of Bia, he doesn't want that Bia to be a Bia's Nus. And therefore, when he married her with Bia, then for sure he would have eliminated and canceled out any T'nai that he made in that marriage, because otherwise it'll turn out that if there's no Kima T'nai, Bitla T'nai, it would be a Bilas Nus. So for that, from that perspective, he gave it to her, he married her in an absolute way without any sort of T'nai. And therefore, when the Mishnah says that if his wife comes back alive and he had married her sister, that he's allowed to resume the marriage, even Rabbi Akiva would concede in this case that Leah does not need a get because there's no shash. What are they going to say? Eishasish Yotzibul get? But even Rabbi Akiva would concede that Leah does not need a get because there's no way you could say that in the eyes of the spectator, they're going to recognize that marriage to Leah based on the fact that Ke'ilu Ruvain, when he married Rachel, he married her with a T'nai. That can't be because Ruvain took Rachel into the canopy, so to speak, into Chuppah, into Chibas Bia, and therefore he was Mavatal any T'nai. So it's quite clear to the spectator that the marriage to Leah is not a valid marriage. And therefore, Rabbi Akiva would admit that Leah does not need a get. So now that we've reconciled the Mishnah with Rabbi Akiva, we're going to ask the following kash. Amalei Rav Ashi Rav Kana. Rabbi Akiva, if our Mishnah reflects the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, let's ask, listening Nami Chamoso, the Mishnah should have also quoted the case of Chamoso, the mother of his wife. He heard that his wife died, and he married the mother of his wife, his former mother-in-law. And now his wife comes trouncing in, she's alive and well. To Hashamina Leila Rabbi Akiva Diyama Liacham Chamoso Liacham Misa La Visrefa. So it means that a man, according to Rabbi Akiva, it seems, is allowed to marry the mother of his wife after his wife passes on. And what would be the din now if he married his mother-in-law with a mistaken impression that his wife is gone and she, in fact, is alive? So the Gemara is now going to try to work Rabbi Akiva into the Mishnah and yet justify why Chamoso was left out. Tisanya, we learned in a brisa which records Machlok Shin Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. But Eish Yisrafu also Veshen, very difficult pasuk. The Torah is Mechayev, an Onish Sreifa, and a person who married his mother-in-law, but it says in the pasuk, Eshen, the two of them, in plural, are Chayev Sreifa. Also, we understand that's the Baal HaIsha, who married her mother. Now, the Eshen, let's take one out of the two V'Eshens, Achas Mihen. So now it seems that according to Divrei Rabbi Yishmael, we're going to interpret the pasuk Eshen as if it's referring to one of them, meaning the one with whom he had Bia. Let's assume the mother-in-law, right? The Bia Sisa. Well, she's Chayev Sreifa. It seems that the word Hain, right? We're gonna take the word Eshen and sort of split Eshen into half. S, and then we read it Hen, and the word Hen means Yachid in Greek. It's this specific woman, which again is the Chamosa. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Oso Veshtein. Bala Isha is Chayev Misa, he married his mother-in-law, and both his mother-in-law and his wife are also included in the punishment. Now, it's impossible to understand that his wife should be Chayev Sreifa just because her husband had a relationship with her mother. She didn't do any Isa. On this, we're going to study a Machlok Shin Abai v'Rava as to how to interpret Rabbi Akiva. According to Abai, Rabbi Akiva understood Shtei Noshim Nisrafos Ima. How is that possible? He married, in addition to his wife, his mother-in-law and his grandmother-in-law. Now, I'm wondering, according to this interpretation of Rabbi Akiva, namely Abaye, what's the chiddush? And I'm wondering, shouldn't this be Shniot Larayos? It says in the footnote that Lidvarav, according to Abaye, Aim Chamoso Nizkeres Bakos. That the pasuk is referring even to the grandmother. That's called Aim Chamosa. So therefore, she's Chayev Sreifa in addition to his mother-in-law, because he had a relationship with both of them. So this is a case from psychologists will have a blast with this. Man marries a woman, then he goes ahead, marries her mother, then he marries her grandmother. I mean, he's fixated on this genealogy. Now, Rava is going to have a different understanding of Rabbi Akiva, and he's going to interpret the pasuk of Ots Eshen the way Rabbi Shmuel understood it, that he married just the mother-in-law. But the pasuk is telling me that the death of a person who married a mother-in-law is conditional on the fact that both of them, meaning his wife and his mother-in-law, are alive. So this man who married his mother-in-law is only going to be chayav bisa if his wife is alive. So now the Gemara is going to say that we have a question of Rav Ashi that according to Rabbi Akiva, the Mishnah should have mentioned Nose es chamoso after there was testimony that his wife died. Abaye, the Omar, he understood, he interpreted the Machlokes Shin Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva with the Mashmos Darshan Ika B'nai. The whole Machlokes boils down to the question of Mashmos Darshan. How do we darshan the pasuk? There's no nafkamina here. There's no Machlokes Ladin. The Rabbi Shmuel Sover Chadaksi that Eshen really means one, right? Because we divided up the S from the hen. And therefore, we don't have to interpret the pasuk as referring to a case where he had a relationship even with the grandmother, with Eim Chamoso. Rabbi Akiva Savar Tartek Siv, that the word Eshen refers to two women, both of whom are Chayav Misa. Therefore, you must interpret as referring to Eim Chamoso, the grandmother. Is Shaper. Now we have no kasha as to why the Mishnah left out the din of a man who mistakenly married his mother-in-law when he heard his wife was gone. Because Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel never argued, and they rather both agreed that there's going to be an Easter even after the death of his wife. So it's not shayach that he would marry his mother-in-law when he heard that his wife died, because you're not allowed to marry your mother-in-law even after the death of your wife. So the whole mission is predicated on the fact that he was mistaken about the death of his wife, relying, as it were, on one aid. But whatever he did and whoever he married, thinking in his mind that his wife died, he was legitimate. He's allowed to marry his mother-in-law after the death of his wife, and for sure he's allowed to marry his grandmother-in-law after the death of his wife. Ella, but Rava, according to Rava's explanation, the Omar Chamosol Yachamisa Ika Beinayu, that the machlokas here between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel is a real machlokas. It's not just a question of what interpretation and drasha did he give for Eshen. According to Rabbi Shmuel, if a man marries his mother-in-law after the death of his wife, then he and the mother-in-law are chayav sreifa, as if his wife was alive. Nothing changed. That's according to Rabbi Shmuel. According to Rabbi Akiva, he's not chayav sreifa unless his wife is still alive. Is then listening nami chamoso. According to Rava, the Mishnah should have also indicated chamoso, that if he thought his wife had passed on and he married her mother, and then it turns out that his wife is in truth alive, that would have fit the pattern. And yet it's left out of our Mishnah. So why, according to Rava's interpretation, that Rabbi Akiva holds his no chiyuv sreifa unless his wife is alive, why was that left out of our Mishnah? So Rav Kahana responds that even according to Rava, we shouldn't raise this objection, because nehi the miyata kra misreifa, but isura mi miyata kra. Although it's true that after the death of his wife, according to Rabbi Akiva, the pasuk is exempting him from Misa, but the Torah never permitted such a relationship. So the miut was only as far as Sreifa. And there's no Sreifa after the death of his wife if he has a relationship with his mother-in-law. But as far as an Isa Nesuin is concerned, was there any exclusion by the Torah? And that means that even after the death of his wife, he's not allowed on a Dorais level, according to Rabbi Akiva, to marry her mother. Even if he's not going to be Chayiv Misa and Sreifa, but there's definitely an Isa Doraisa, Minat Torah, to marry his mother-in-law. So therefore, it's not shaykh to say that he married her when he heard his wife die. So what if his wife died? There's still an Isra, even according to Rava's interpretation of Rabbi Akiva. Okay, now the Gemara thinks that the reason why the husband is allowed to resume his marriage with Rachel when she comes back from Medina Sayyam is because the marriage to Leah was done under false premises. It was a shogeg situation. We should not allow Reuven to resume his relationship, his marriage with Rachel, once he had a relationship with Leah. And it's as if there were Nesuin to Leah. And a man mistakenly married a woman based on the testimony of one witness, thinking that his wife was gone, and her husband shows up. And she's not allowed to go back to him and resume that relationship. Because we're going to view it as if she got married b'mezid, probably because she should have checked it out and not rely on the testimony of one aide. So the Gemara wants to say that this same logic should apply to the question of whether Reuven's allowed to resume his relationship with Rachel when he had a relationship with Leah, because just like a married woman whose husband supposedly died, she got married. So we're going to view that marriage as a deliberate violation of an each situation. So too here, we're going to view the marriage to Leah as some sort of deliberate a deliberate violation of Achos Isha. I'm not sure exactly why the Gemara makes this equation. I mean, in the case of an Ashes Baila Polach Baila Medina Sayyam, so that's mamish of Ashes Ish of Tuma of a Nitmes. But here he had a relationship with a sister. So I think what was going on here, and if you have any notes there that can help, because this is really tough. I think what's going on here in the Gemara's Kasha is that the marriage between Reuven and Leah, when Reuven assumes that Rachel, his wife, is dead, that marriage to Leah should be viewed as a valid marriage. And therefore, he's no longer allowed to resume his relationship with Rachel because he's married Kaviyachol to Leah. Again, I'll just read you the one line in Masechet. I think he could have been a little bit more pedagogic. He says, "B'shchiva dachosa shetichashev ki'ilu chalu nisue achos labayla." I think the word achos is referring to Leah. V'te'aser ha'ish al bayla. Now we're going back to Rachel. You see where the ambiguity is. Ambiguity. Mishum achos isha. Now Rachel, we turn the tables around, becomes achos isha. What is the Gemara deriving from Isha Shalach Bailam Dinas Hayam? I think what we're trying to derive here is that shogeg is not a mitigating factor here. When a woman hears that her husband died and gets married based on that assumption, she's a shogeg. And she didn't do a deliberate act of adultery. And yet, despite the fact that she's a shogeg, we consider it as if she was married to this other husband. So at that point is not crystal clear. Let's see how the Gemara rejects it. Lo dummy. We should not equate the case of Eshes Ish, who got married to someone else, betos, to the case of a man who marries his wife's sister, betos. Ishto, the case of a married woman, and she got married b'shogeg to some other man, did mazid, in other words, had it been mazid that she married someone else, asira midoraisa, that would be tuma doraisa, and she could not resume her relationship with her first husband, is therefore b'shogeg gazu barabana. So now you can understand there's a framework for a case of mazid of nitmes, and therefore we might prohibit her even though she's only a shogeg, as we said many times, because she should have been more careful before she married.